The crunch of plastic under a polished leather shoe was the loudest sound in the hallway. It wasn't just a noise, it was the sound of a month's rent, a year of savings, and his daughter's only connection to the world snapping into pieces. Lucas froze, his grip tightening on the mop handle until his knuckles turned white. He watched as Julian, the 14-year-old son of the school board's treasurer, lifted his expensive loafer. Beneath it lay the pink, custom-molded hearing aid that belonged to Mia. It was smashed, the delicate wires exposed like veins in an open wound. "Oops," Julian sneered, kicking the debris toward the trash can. "I think you dropped some trash. Janitor, better clean it up. That's what we pay you for, isn't it?" Lucas felt a fire ignite in his chest, a burning rage that demanded he drop the mop and teach this spoiled brat a lesson in respect, Mom. But then, the image of Mia's smiling face flashed in his mind. He thought of the cold, damp basement they called home. He thought of the unpaid heating bill sitting on the kitchen table. He couldn't lose this job. He simply couldn't. Slowly, painfully, Lucas lowered his gaze. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at the floor. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the immense effort of suppression. "I'll clean it up immediately." He knelt on the cold tiles, picking up the broken pieces of the device. The battery compartment was crushed. It was beyond repair. As he gathered the fragments, he heard the laughter of Julian and his entourage echoing down the corridor, fading away like a nightmare that refused to end. Lucas placed the broken pieces into his pocket. Right next to his heart, it felt heavy, like a stone. How was he going to tell her? How could he tell his silent angel that the world had just become a little quieter and a lot colder? As Lucas stood up, he noticed a shadow lingering at the end of the hallway. He thought everyone had left, but someone had been watching. A figure in a dark coat stood motionless, observing his humiliation before turning the corner and vanishing into the gloom. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and boiled cabbage. It was a smell Lucas had grown used to, but tonight it felt suffocating. He sat at the small, wobbling wooden table, watching Mia eat. She was 10 years old, with eyes as deep and dark as the night sky. She ate her dinner, a thin soup, and the heel of a stale loaf of bread with a grace that belonged in a palace, not a basement. She didn't know about the hearing aid yet. She wasn't wearing it because the battery had died that morning, or so she thought. Lucas watched her hands. They were small, bruised slightly at the wrists. He reached out and gently touched her arm. Mia looked up, her eyes bright. She put down her spoon and raised her hands, signing rapidly. "The soup is delicious. Papa, you are the best chef." Lucas forced a smile. It felt like a mask cracking on his face. He signed back, his movements slow and weary. "I'm glad, little bird." "How was school?" Mia hesitated. For a split second, a shadow crossed her face. She pulled her sleeves down over her wrists. Then, the bright smile returned. Forced and fragile, she signed, "It was good. I played tag. I fell down. That is why my uniform is dirty." Lucas knew she was lying. He had seen the mud on her back when she came home. It wasn't from a fall. It was a footprint. Someone had stomped on her. His heart shattered all over again, mirroring the broken device in his pocket. He wanted to scream, to promise her he would burn the world down to keep her safe. But he was powerless. He was just the janitor. He reached into his pocket and fingered the sharp edges of the broken plastic. He couldn't tell her tonight. He couldn't break her heart while she was trying so hard to protect his. The next morning, The school cafeteria was a chaotic sea of noise and movement. Lucas was on duty, pushing his cart near the waste disposal area. He kept his head down, the cap of his uniform pulled low. He didn't want to see the students throwing away whole apples and sandwiches that cost more than his daily wage. Mia sat alone at the very end of a long table. She had no hearing aid today, so she existed in a bubble of absolute silence. She watched the mouths of the other children moving, laughing, shouting, but to her, it was a silent movie without subtitles. Then, she saw something the others ignored. An old woman, frail and bent with age, was struggling with a heavy garbage bag near the exit. She wore the gray uniform of the temporary cleaning staff. Her hands shook as she tried to lift the bag, and suddenly it tore. Leftover spaghetti and sauce spilled all over her worn-out shoes. A supervisor, a man with a red face and a loud voice, stormed over. Lucas couldn't hear what was said from his distance, but he saw the supervisor pointing a finger in the old woman's face. The woman shrank back, trembling. The students nearby laughed. Someone threw a bread roll at the old woman. It bounced off her shoulder. Mia didn't hesitate. She stood up. She didn't have words to shout, and she couldn't hear the insults, but she understood cruelty. She walked over to the old woman, ignoring the jeers of her classmates. Mia knelt down into the mess of spaghetti. She didn't care about her clean uniform. She picked up the trash with her bare hands, helping the old woman. When the mess was cleared, Mia reached into her pocket. She pulled out half of a sandwich, her lunch, which Lucas had made with the last of their ham. She broke it in two and offered the larger half to the old woman. The old woman looked at the sandwich, then up at Mia. Her eyes, previously dull and watery, suddenly sharpened. They weren't the eyes of a helpless cleaner. They were piercing, intelligent, and filled with a sudden, intense curiosity. The old woman took the sandwich, but she didn't eat it. She leaned in close to Mia, her lips moving slowly so Mia could read them. "You have a warrior's heart, child," she whispered. "But be careful. The wolves in this school don't like it when the sheep stand tall." Just then, Julian stepped into the cafeteria, spotting the scene with a cruel grin spreading across his face. The storm clouds that had been gathering outside seemed to seep into the school corridors. It was the last period, physical education. Mia sat on the bleachers, excused from participating because, as the gym teacher loudly claimed, she couldn't hear the whistle anyway. She was sketching in her battered notebook, the only sanctuary she had left. Across the gym, Julian was showing off. He wasn't playing basketball. He was displaying his wrist. A gold Rolex, studded with diamonds, caught the harsh fluorescent lights. "My dad got it for me for getting a C+, he bragged to his sycophants. "It costs more than this entire building." Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. "It's gone! My watch, it's gone!" The gym fell silent. Julian was frantically patting his pockets, his face a mask of theatrical panic. He pointed a shaking finger at the bleachers. "I took it off to shoot a hoop. I put it right there, and now she's sitting next to it." All eyes turned to Mia. She didn't hear the accusation, but she felt the weight of 50 stares crushing her. Before she could react, Julian and 2 teachers were storming toward her. One of the teachers, Mr. Henderson, didn't ask. He simply grabbed Mia's backpack, a faded pink bag with a broken zipper, and dumped its contents onto the polished floor. Old pencils, a half-eaten apple, and the sketchbook tumbled out. And there, sliding out from the front pocket where it had clearly been planted, was the gold watch. The gasp from the students was audible. Mia looked at the watch in horror. She shook her head frantically, her hands signing no, 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 geek. But nobody was looking at her hands. They were looking at the evidence. Julian smirked, a cold, predatory smile that only Mia saw. "Thief," he mouthed. "Filthy little thief." The gym doors banged open. Lucas ran in, panting, holding his mop. He saw his daughter trembling, surrounded by accusing giants. "Don't touch her," he yelled, dropping the mop. "But, Mr. Henderson stepped forward, crossing his arms. "Save your breath, janitor. We've already called the police, and the principal wants you. Now." Chapter 5. The Principal's Ultimatum. Principal Vance's office smelled of expensive mahogany and cigar smoke, a stark contrast to the bleach and sweat that clung to Lucas's uniform. Lucas stood in the center of the Persian rug, his hat in his hands. Head bowed, Mia stood behind him, clutching his leg, her face buried in his trousers. Vance didn't look up from his paperwork for a long time. He let the silence stretch, a power move designed to make Lucas feel small. Finally, he leaned back, adjusting his silk tie. "Theft is a serious crime, Lucas," Vance said, his voice smooth and poisonous. "Especially when the victim is the son of our biggest donor." "She didn't do it," Lucas said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "She's 10 years old. She doesn't even know what a Rolex is. It was a setup." Vance chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "The truth is irrelevant. What matters is the optics. Julian's father is furious. He wants to press charges. He wants Mia in juvenile detention. And naturally, the school cannot employ the father of a criminal." Lucas felt the room spin. "Please, I need this job. She needs to stay in school. She has nowhere else to go." Vance leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with malice. "There is one way. Julian's father is willing to drop the charges if the item is restored and damages are paid. Emotional damages." He slid a piece of paper across the desk. Lucas looked at the number. $10,000. It was an impossible sum. It was more money than he had seen in his entire life. "You have 24 hours, Vance said, checking his own expensive watch. "Bring the cash, or bring a lawyer, and if you don't, well, I hear the state orphanages are quite full this time of year." As they walked out of the office, defeated, Lucas saw the old cleaning woman, Agnes, mopping the floor near the door. She paused, looking at Lucas with an unreadable expression. She tapped her wrist, as if checking the time, and whispered something to the air. "Time reveals all kings and beggars." Lucas didn't have the energy to ask what she meant. He had a mission. The rain was relentless, washing the grime of the city into the gutters. Lucas stood in front of Quick Cash Pawn, the neon sign buzzing and flickering in the twilight. He looked down at his hand. On his ring finger sat a simple gold band. It wasn't thick, and the gold was scratched from years of manual labor, but it was the most precious thing he owned. It was the ring Sarah had put on his finger 2 days before she died giving birth to Mia. It was the promise that he wasn't alone. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he whispered to the rain, "but I have to save her." He pushed open the heavy door. A bell chimed. The pawnbroker. A man with greasy skin and eyes that weighed souls in carats looked up from behind a bulletproof glass. "Help you," the man grunted. Lucas struggled to pull the ring off. His hands were swollen from work. When it finally came free, his finger felt naked, cold. He slid the ring through the slot. "How much?" The broker put a loop to his eye. He examined the inscription inside. "Forever, Sarah." He tossed it onto a digital scale. It's thin, old gold. Scrap value mainly. "It's priceless," Lucas choked out. "Please, I need 10,000. The broker laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Buddy, this is worth $200, maybe 3 if I'm feeling generous. You want 10 grand. You got a kidney to sell." Lucas felt his knees buckle. $300. It wasn't even a fraction. He gripped the counter. "Please, it's for my daughter. She's in trouble." $350, final offer, take it or leave it. Lucas closed his eyes. A tear escaped, hot and angry. He nodded. As the broker counted out the greasy bills, Lucas felt a part of his soul dying. He took the money. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough. As Lucas stepped back out into the rain, clutching the pathetic wad of cash, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "I know you're short on cash. Meet me behind the school warehouse at midnight. Come alone. We have a proposition regarding your debt." Lucas stared at the screen. Was this a lifeline or a trap? The mysterious text message had been a cruel summons, not a lifeline. It was a demand from Principal Vance work the winter gala tonight. Unpaid. Considerate interest on your debt. Bring the girl. We need someone to collect trash. Now, the school gymnasium was unrecognizable. Gone were the basketball hoops and sweat stains, replaced by cascading silk drapes, ice sculptures, and a chandelier that cost more than Lucas would earn in 10 lifetimes. It was the annual Donors Gala, a night where the city's elite gathered to congratulate themselves on their charity while sipping vintage champagne. Lucas wore a stiff, ill-fitting waiter's vest that smelled of mothballs. He moved through the crowd like a ghost. Balancing a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres, the guests looked right through him. To them, he wasn't a man, he was just a pair of hands holding a tray. Mia sat in the far corner, hidden behind a massive potted fern. She was dressed in her best Sunday dress, a faded blue cotton frock that she had outgrown months ago. She was trying to make herself invisible, clutching her sketchbook to her chest. Her eyes darted around the room. Fearful. Without her hearing aid. The gala was a blur of terrifying motion, laughing mouths showing too many teeth, crystal glasses clinking in a silent toast. Julian and his father, Mr. Thorne, stood in the center of the room. Mr. Thorne was a towering man with a voice that boomed. Commanding attention, Julian, looking like a miniature clone of his father in a bespoke tuxedo, pointed across the room at Lucas. He whispered something to his father, and both of them smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of a predator spotting a wounded gazelle. Lucas felt their eyes on him. His hands trembled slightly, the crystal flutes on his tray rattling. He knew a storm was coming, right here amidst the violins and velvet. As Lucas turned to head back to the kitchen, Mr. Thorne stepped directly into his path. The music seemed to stop. Thorne didn't move aside. He stood like a wall of granite, holding a glass of red wine that looked suspiciously like blood in the dim light. "Janitor," Thorne said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, "my glass is empty. Fix it." Chapter 8. The Public Humiliation. Lucas lowered his head. "Yes, sir. I'll get a fresh bottle." "No," Thorne barked. He snapped his fingers, and Julian appeared with a magnum of expensive Bordeaux. "Pour it here, now." Lucas's hands were shaking uncontrollably now. The exhaustion, the hunger, and the sheer terror of the debt were taking their toll. He reached for the bottle Julian held out, but as Lucas's fingers grazed the glass, Julian deliberately let go. Smash! The bottle hit the marble floor, exploding in a shower of dark red liquid and glass shards. The wine splashed onto Mr. Thorne's pristine Italian trousers and Julian's polished shoes. The entire hall went deadly silent. The orchestra stopped playing. "You clumsy idiot," Julian screamed, his voice cracking. "Look what you did. This is a $5,000 suit." I didn't," Lucas stammered. dropping to his knees instinctively to pick up the glass. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it up." "Clean it, Mr. Thorne's voice was ice cold. He looked down at Lucas with pure disgust. "You just wasted a bottle of wine worth more than your annual salary, and you ruined my evening." Mia saw her father on the floor. She didn't hear the crash, but she felt the vibration of the anger in the room. She dropped her sketchbook and ran from her hiding spot. She threw herself next to Lucas, using her small hands to try and wipe the wine from the floor with the hem of her dress. "Get away from me, you little mute rat!" Julian shouted. "Kicking out?" His foot connected with Mia's shoulder, knocking her backward into the puddle of wine and glass. Lucas didn't think. He roared a sound of pure primal fury and grabbed Julian's ankle to stop him from kicking again. The crowd gasped. "Assault!" someone shrieked. Security guards began to move in from the shadows, but Mr. Tharan held up the hand. "Wait," he said, a cruel idea forming in his eyes. "Let's handle this gentlemanly." Mr. Thorne looked down at Lucas, who was now cradling Mia, checking her for cuts. The red wine soaked into Lucas's knees, looking like a gruesome injury. "You touched my son," Thorne said softly. "That's assault on a minor. I could have you arrested right now. You'd go to prison, your daughter goes to the system tonight." Lucas looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Please, no. She's all I have. I'll do anything. I'll pay you back. I'll work for free for the rest of my life." Thorne laughed. "I don't need your labor, janitor. I have machines for that. What I need is an apology, a real one." Thorne pointed to his wine-stained shoe. "Your clumsiness caused this mess. It's only fitting you clean it up. With your tongue." The crowd murmured. Some looked away in discomfort, but many watched with morbid fascination. Phones raised to record. "Dad, no," Mia signed, her hands shaking violently. She tugged at his shirt. "Stand up! Papa, please, stand up!" Lucas looked at his daughter. He saw the terror in her eyes. If he stood up and fought, he lost her. If he knelt, he lost his dignity. But he kept her safe. It was the easiest choice in the world. Slowly, agonizingly, Lucas bent forward. He wasn't a man anymore. He was a father. He lowered his head toward the shoe. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Every second felt like an eternity. He could smell the leather polish and the acrid scent of the wine. He closed his eyes, swallowing his pride, swallowing the bile in his throat. For Mia. He repeated in his mind, just for Mia. He leaned down, just inches before Lucas made contact. A loud, rhythmic tapping sound echoed through the hall. Clack, clack, clack. It was the sound of a cane hitting the marble floor with authority. A voice, cracked with age but thundering with power, cut through the silence like a blade. "Lift your head, Lucas. No king should ever bow to a jester." The cane's strike against the floor hung in the air, but the adrenaline in the room was too high for everyone to process it immediately. Lucas was still frozen, mere inches from the shoe. But Mia moved. With the ferocity of a wounded cub protecting its parent, she threw herself between her father and Mr. Thorne. She didn't care about the size difference. She pushed Thorne's leg with all her might, causing the large man to stumble back a step in surprise. "You little brat," Thorne snarled, raising his hand. Mia didn't flinch. She stood tall, her small chest heaving. She looked at the crowd of wealthy, well-dressed onlookers who were recording the scene on their phones. Tears streamed down her face, but her hands flew up, signing with a speed and intensity that blurred in the air. It was a silent scream, a monologue of pure agony that needed no voice to be understood. "He is a king," she signed, her fingers sharp and accusatory. He cleans your filth. He fixes what you break. He sells his memories to feed me. He is gold, and you are all dust. She pointed a shaking finger at Julian, then at Thorn, and finally pounded her small fist against her own heart. You have money. She signed, her face contorted with grief. But you have no heart. You are the poor ones. You are empty. The room fell into an uncomfortable hush. Even those who didn't know sign language felt the raw power of her rebuke. For a moment, the shame was palpable, but then Julian let out a cruel, high-pitched laugh. Look at her waving her hands, Julian mocked. Is she trying to fly away? What a freak show. The laughter returned, rippling through the crowd like a contagion, breaking the spell. Lucas grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her back to his chest, shielding her ears from the mockery she couldn't hear but could see on their twisted faces. Security, Thorn bellowed, regaining his composure. Get this trash out of here, and throw the old hag out too, whoever she is. Two burly guards in black suits stepped forward, reaching for Lucas, but before they could touch him, the old woman with the cane stepped into the light. It was Agnes, the cafeteria cleaner. She looked out of place amidst the silk and diamonds, wearing her gray, stained smock and leaning heavily on a wooden cane. But there was something different about her posture now. She wasn't hunched over a mop bucket. She stood with a spine of steel. One of the guards, a man named Brutus, who enjoyed his job a little too much, sneered at her. Wrong room, Grandma. The dumpster is out back. He reached out to grab her arm, intending to shove her aside. Agnes didn't retreat. She didn't even blink. She simply lifted her cane and, with a lightning-fast movement, pressed the tip of it firmly against the center of the guard's chest. It wasn't a strike, but a check, a warning. Touch me, Agnes said, her voice low but carrying a resonance that vibrated through the floorboards. And you will never work in this city again, not even as a beggar. Brutus froze. There was an authority in her tone that triggered a primal instinct, the instinct that tells a predator they have just walked into the den of a dragon. Mr. Thorn marched over, his face purple with rage. Who do you think you are? You're just the help. I donate millions to this school I own. This room, I want them gone. And I want you fired. Agnes slowly turned her head to look at Thorn, her eyes, previously hidden under the brim of a cleaning cap, locked onto his. They were cold, calculating, and terrifyingly familiar. You own nothing. Arthur? She said, using his first name with a casual disrespect that made the crowd gasp. You lease this room, you lease your reputation, and frankly, you are behind on your payments. Principal Vance came running over, sweating profusely. Mrs. Agnes, what are you doing? Please, get back to the kitchen before you embarrass us further. Agnes looked at Vance, then slowly reached up to the collar of her gray cleaning smock. Embarrassment, she murmured, is about to be redefined. With a decisive tear of Velcro, Agnes pulled the gray smock from her shoulders and let it fall to the floor. Underneath, she wasn't wearing rags. She was wearing a vintage Chanel suit, black as midnight and tailored to perfection. Around her neck, no longer hidden by the high collar of the uniform, hung a necklace, a simple, heavy pendant bearing the crest of the Everhart Foundation. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. Every wealthy socialite, every donor, every board member knew that crest. It was the symbol of the conglomerate that owned the land the school was built on, the bank that held their mortgages, and the hospital where they were born. Principal Vance's knees actually knocked together. His face went from red to paper white. Madam Chairwoman, he squeaked. Mrs. Everhart. I prefer grandmother these days, Agnes said, smoothing her jacket. She looked at the crowd, her gaze sweeping over them like a searchlight. I decided to visit my investments incognito. I wanted to see what kind of future leaders we are raising here. She walked over to Lucas, who was still kneeling, clutching Mia. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. She offered a hand that wore a ring worth more than the school itself to the janitor. "Stand up, Lucas," she said softly, her voice changing from iron to velvet. "You are the only gentleman in this room." Lucas took her hand, bewildered. He stood up, pulling Mia with him. Agnes turned back to Thorne and Vance. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I saw everything," she announced. "I saw the hearing aid. I saw the Rolex planted in the bag. I saw the wine bottle dropped on purpose. And I saw a father willing to sacrifice his dignity for his chud." She stepped closer to Thorne, who was now shrinking back, his arrogance evaporating like mist. "Arthur," she said, her voice dangerously calm, "you said you wanted an apology. You said you wanted someone to clean up the mess." She pulled a phone from her pocket and held it up. "I just live-streamed the last 10 minutes to the board of directors. They are very eager to hear your apology, but I don't think they want to hear it from your mouth." The silence in the ballroom was different now. It wasn't the silence of fear, it was the silence of a guillotine blade hovering before the drop. "Mr. Thorne tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry cough. "Agnes, Mrs. Everhart," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "Let's not be dramatic. It was a misunderstanding, a joke, boys being boys." "A joke," Agnes repeated, testing the word. She walked slowly toward Principal Vance. "And you, Principal, was the $10,000 extortion also a joke?" Vance opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping on a dock. Agnes turned to Mia. She lowered herself to one knee, a gesture of immense respect that made the socialites whisper again. She looked into Mia's eyes and raised her hands. Her movements were stiff with age, but clear. "Teach me," Agnes signed. "Teach me the sign for leave." Mia blinked, tears drying on her cheeks. She slowly raised her hand, pointing her thumb over her shoulder in a sharp, dismissive motion. Agnes nodded. She stood up, turning to face Vance and Thorne. She raised her hand and mimicked the gesture perfectly. "You are relieved of your duties. Principal Vance, effective immediately," Agnes said. "Security will escort you off the premises. Do not clear your desk. We will mail your personal effects." Vance collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Then she turned to Thorne. "As for you, Arthur, the Everhart Foundation is withdrawing all funding from your construction firm. I believe that constitutes about 80% of your revenue." Thorne's face went gray. "You can't do that. That will bankrupt me." "Then I suggest you learn to mop," Agnes said coldly. "I hear there's a vacancy for a janitor. Though, honestly, I wouldn't trust you with the keys." She looked down at Julian, who was trembling behind his father. "And this young man will be expelled. He needs to learn that character is not inherited. It is built." As security dragged a protesting Thorne toward the exit, Agnes turned back to Lucas. The room waited for the final act. Agnes didn't smile. She looked serious. "Now, Lucas," she said, "we have a problem. You sold something that didn't belong to you." Lucas's heart stopped. Had he done something wrong? Was this another trap? I don't understand." "Ma'am, the ring. It was mine." "No," Agnes said. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out a small velvet box. "A wedding ring carries a promise of eternity. You cannot sell eternity for a temporary debt." She opened the box. There, resting on the velvet cushion, was Lucas's gold band. It had been polished, glowing warmly under the chandelier lights. I bought it back from the pawn shop an hour ago, Agnes whispered. I have been following you. Lucas, I needed to know if there was still a decent man left in this city. She took his hand, rough, calloused, stained with the wine of humiliation, and placed the ring back on his finger. I am getting too old to run this empire alone, Agnes announced to the room. I need someone who understands the value of a dollar and the value of a human soul. I don't need a businessman. I need a father. She signaled to an assistant, who brought over a document. Lucas, I am appointing you as the new director of operations for the Everhart Foundation. Your first job is to overhaul the scholarship program for children with disabilities. Lucas stared at her topple, unable to breathe. Ma'am, I'm just a janitor. I don't know how to be a director. Agnes smiled. A genuine, warm smile that lit up her wrinkled face. You knew how to kneel to save your daughter. That makes you more qualified than any man in this room. She turned to Mia. And for you, little warrior, tomorrow we go to the specialist. You will have the best hearing aids technology can build, and you will never, ever have to listen to fools again. Mia looked at the hearing aids, then at her father, then at Agnes. She didn't sign thank you. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in years. She opened her mouth, straining her vocal cords, pushing air through a throat unused to speech. A single, cracked sound emerged. 6 months later, the gallery was quiet, but it was a respectful silence, not an empty one. The walls were lined with charcoal sketches, powerful, raw images of life seen from the shadows. There was a sketch of a broken hearing aid, a sketch of a mop bucket reflecting a king's crown, a sketch of an old woman with eyes like a hawk. The exhibition was titled The Sounds of Silence. Lucas stood near the entrance. He wore a tailored navy suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He didn't look like a different man. He looked like the man he was always meant to be. He checked his watch, not a Rolex, but a sturdy, reliable timepiece. Director, a voice called out. It was the new principal, a young woman with kind eyes. The scholarship board is ready for you. In a minute, Lucas smiled. He looked across the room. Mia was standing next to Agnes. Mia wore a small, sleek device behind her ear. She was laughing a bright musical sound that filled the room. She was signing to a group of children, some in wheelchairs, some with crutches, explaining her art. Agnes caught Lucas's eye and winked. She was sitting in a wheelchair now, her energy fading, but her spirit brighter than ever. Through the large glass window of the gallery, Lucas could see the street below. It was snowing. Across the street, a man in a ragged coat was shoveling snow off the sidewalk in front of a convenience store. It was Arthur Thorne. He looked cold. He looked tired. Lucas watched him for a moment. There was no anger in his heart anymore, only a deep, quiet gratitude. He felt a small hand slip into his. Mia had come over. She looked at the man outside, then up at her father. She touched her new hearing aid, then signed, "Can you hear it?" "Papa." Lucas knelt down, meeting her eyes. Hear what he signed back. Mia smiled, placing her hand on his chest. "The sound of our heartbeat. It's the loudest thing in the world." Lucas hugged her tight. The silence of the past replaced by the symphony of their future.